Now on live. Here we go. And let me find our guest, our esteemed guest, who is one of the top designers ever, who really uh, at the time that I was modeling. And we have him here today. And we are going to talk about the men's business and how it evolved and uh, where it's going, and uh, way back in the golden age of modeling, of how the man really started to shine. Uh, and I think Jeffrey is perfect for that, because he started out as a young guy, started in the business, and I basically grew up with him in the men's business, and especially when I was we're trying to find him as of now. Of course, this is all brought to you by NADIA, SHAHRIK, and Era Stories, and with the help of Mohammed, who really knows what he's doing on the really knows what he's doing, the tech end of this. All right, here's Jeffrey. Jeffrey Banks, so good to see you, man.
It's great to see you, Joey.
We go back. I started as a model in the 60s. And when I was a model in the 60s, there really wasn't a big men's business. There were a few brands out there, but it was reserved for, a lot of women in the ads, and maybe the guy was there. But the guy was an accessory in the 60s.
Absolutely.
To the model. And then finally, at the end of the 60s, a European designer decided to show in the United States. And once he started showing, men came into their own as in designer clothes, whereas everything designed was for the woman. Men usually worked for Sears and Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, J.C. Penney. That was their big fashion thing.
Right.
And in those days, men had to be 6 foot and 40 regular.
Right.
That meant because the clothes came and fit that size. The look was always different. Every guy had a different look. But we were confined to finding guys who were 6 foot and 40 regular. Of course, I wasn't 6 foot. I was a 40 regular, but I had the help of the New York telephone book at the time that I would stand up, so the girls wouldn't dwarf me. And when I was doing a shot for J.C. Penney's or Sears and Roebuck, I was able to be as tall as the other guys. That's why I never did slacks, because they couldn't show me full length. I was much shorter. So now, in the 60s, you're a teenager. You have a dream to be a designer.
That's right.
I'm a model. I become an agent in 69, 70. So now, where did you go from there, Jeffrey? How did you follow your dream?
Well, I always knew I wanted to be a designer. From the time I was about 10 years old, I designed my mother's Easter outfit. I picked out the fabric. I went with her to her dressmaker. My mother, who sews beautifully, and this dressmaker who was phenomenal, who could make anything from a sketch, from a photograph, from a newspaper clipping. They listened to this bossy little 10-year-old saying, no, make the skirt shorter, make the bust higher. But she wore this dress and coat on Easter Sunday at church, and she got rave reviews. And as they say, the die was cast. I never turned back from that moment in time. I knew that's exactly what I wanted to do. How I got into the business was I used to shop at a store called Britches of Georgetown in Washington, D.C., where I grew up. Britches was the fanciest, most expensive, most stylish store in a very conservative city called Washington, D.C. And they were one of the first 5 stores in the country to carry Ralph Lauren's clothing, polo. When Ralph first came out with his polo ties, they were the first to carry his ties, and then as he added shirts and suits and sportswear, they carried it. And I was enamored with his clothes. I thought they were spectacular. I loved the point of view of what he was trying to say, that sort of Gatsby, you know, to the manor born kind of feeling about his clothes. And I was in the store. I was 15 one day after school, and I was rummaging through the racks, and the assistant manager came over to me and said, I've seen you in here before. I think you might be our youngest customer. How old are you, 18? And I said, no, I'm 15. He said, 15? I said, yeah.
Wow.
He said, well, I'm going to tell you a secret. We're going to open a second store next year. I said, yeah, I know, the old Saks Pasternak building on Connecticut Avenue. And he goes, how the hell do you know that? And I said, I read DNR. And he goes, you read DNR? DNR is the men's version of Women's Wear Daily.
Right.
And I said, yeah, I've had a subscription since I was 12. He said, would you like to work for us? I said, absolutely. And that Saturday, I started the first job I'd ever had, selling clothes, which I'd never done. And I have to tell you, Joey, I loved it. I loved every minute of it. It was so much fun to help guys who couldn't put a shirt and tie together to save their lives.
Yeah.
You know, look good. And then to have their wives and girlfriends come back the next week and say, I don't know what you did, just do it again.
Do it again. Huh? And so starting out like that and emulating Ralph Lauren with the ties and stuff like that, you wound up working with him or working for him. I mean, tell us about that.
The following year, when I was 16, Ralph came down to do a charity fashion show for the Red Cross for Valentine's Day. And I was very proud of the fact that in elementary school, junior high school, and now high school, I had a perfect attendance record. I'd never missed a day of school. But when I found out he was coming that Friday, I told my parents, I'm not going to school on Friday. I'm going to meet Ralph Lauren. You write a note, you lie, I don't care what you have to say, but I am not going to school. I'm going to meet this man. And so they wrote a note saying I was going to be at the dentist all day. And I went to the store. I got there early. And the owners of the store said to me, do you have your driver's license? And I said, yeah, for a couple of months now. They said, here, take the station wagon keys and the company station wagon and pick Ralph up at the airport. Wow. I'm like, are you kidding me? And they said, no. So I went to the airport, got a flat tire on the way. Fortunately, there was a spare in the back. I flagged someone down to help me change the tire. Got to the airport late. Fortunately, Ralph's plane was late. So his plane touched down just as I was getting to the airport. And I drove him and his head of sales, Joe Parado, back to the store and spent the weekend, you know, with Ralph that Friday and Saturday. He was doing an in-store appearance after the fashion show for Red Cross. And I told him that I wanted to be a designer and that I was going to come to New York to go to college, design school. And he said, well, when you come to look at schools in New York, give me a call. I might have a job for you. Well, that's all I needed to hear, Joey. Wow. That I might have a job for you kept me going for a solid year. And a year later, I came up to New York to look at colleges with my mother. And the next day, I had an appointment to meet Ralph. And this is a great story. So I get to the office. The receptionist tells me to have a seat. She points at this denim-covered love seat. There's a black man sitting there, and I sit down next to him because it's kind of it's not even a sofa, it's like a love seat. And I turn to him and I say, excuse me, aren't you Bobby Short? And he goes, why, yes, I am. And I mean, he couldn't believe that at 17, I knew who he was, and we started talking. And A few minutes later, Ralph comes down and he says, Jeffrey, have you met Bobby? And Bobby goes, oh, we're old friends, you know. And we left him, and I went up to Ralph's office, and I had my little portfolio of sketches. He never once asked to see them. I never even unzipped it. We just sat and talked about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and Cary Grant and all the people he loved and all the people I loved for an hour and a half. And finally, I realized my poor mother was probably thinking I was dead. I told her to go to Bob and tell her and wait for me. And Ralph said, I'll call you within 2 weeks and let you know whether you have a job. And exactly 2 weeks later, he called me and told me I had a job.
Wow.
So I, 2 weeks, 3 weeks out of high school and 2 months before I started college, I was in New York working as Ralph Lauren's second assistant.
You see that? You had a dream. You were in the right place at the right time. You had a lot of fabulous breaks to meet Ralph, and there you are now. Now you're in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
You're working for Ralph, and I assume you're working on his men's line.
That's right.
And in those days, am I correct? Men's fashion was very personal. It was, you know, how people wanted to dress, if they wanted a double-breasted suit or a single-breasted suit. But everybody wore ties, suits, and sportswear was there, but it wasn't as big as it is today.
No.
So you're there, and you've got a lot of traditional stuff. I assume in the beginning, you're very traditional.
Yeah.
And Ralph is that way also.
Exactly. Exactly. And of course, you know, most men who are involved in any kinds of business wore suits to work. I mean, unless you were a plumber or a firefighter or something like that, you know, if you were in the regular industry, whether it was advertising or sales, or whatever, you wore a suit and tie to work. And that's how he started. He made beautiful suits and ties. His ties and shirts were different from what was around there. And that was one of the things I really learned about Ralph. As elegant and traditional as he was to a certain degree, there was the difference in width, and there was the difference in fabrication of his ties and his shirts that made people really sit up and take notice. And, you know, the thing that I always remember about that beginning was that Polo was a very small company. There were maybe 15 people in the whole company at that moment in time, because he'd not been in business for even 10 years at that point. And I used to say to people, I work for Polo, and they'd say, what's Polo? I mean, he hadn't done advertising yet. He didn't have stores yet. I mean, it was really the nascent beginnings of his business.
Were you on 55th? Excuse me. Were you on 55th Street or 56th Street?
40 West 55th Street.
That's right. I remember
right
that.
Next door to what is today Michael's restaurant. In those days, it was the Italian Pavilion.
Exactly.
And John White's had his office in the building. There were a couple of other men's. It was an old apartment building that had been converted.
Right.
So all the bathrooms were real bathrooms with bathtubs and so forth and so on. And I was his second assistant. Buffy Baratella was his first assistant who had only been hired 2 or 3 months before I started.
You were.
And Buffy had been an editor at Daily News Record. She'd been the chief fashion editor at Daily News Record before she started working for Ralph. But what I was going to say was, I knew even then he was going to be as big as he is now. He believed in himself. I believed in him. The people who worked for him, like Joe Barata, believed in him. And he had this unerring vision of where he wanted to be in the firmament of fashion. And he went after it. He went after it and he achieved it. And I always thought he would.
Now, let me ask you, when did you decide to go out on your own? What was the first line that you designed, and why did you pick going heavily into men?
Well, I felt early on, I thought I was going to be a women's wear designer, but as I looked at it, especially during that period of time, the early 70s, the fastest changing part of fashion was men's fashion. For the first time, men were starting to break out a little bit with color, break out a little bit with pattern. You had the Beatles going on, you had Carnaby Street and Tommy Nutter and these other Savile Row people who were doing untraditional clothing. And I mean, people don't realize it, but Ralph's clothes in the beginning, there was some avant-gardeness to those clothes. I mean, the wide tie, the unconstructed denim suit. These were all things that were not part of the vocabulary of traditional clothing. So what happened was I had worked for Ralph for three years, and then my last year of school, I had switched schools, and it was much harder to work full-time and go to school full-time. And so eventually I had to make a decision. Was I gonna stay in school and finish school, get my degree, or was I gonna go work for him full-time? Ralph wanted me to quit school. He said the whole reason you go to school is to have the job you already have. My parents said, it's up to you. They realized that I was happy in New York and happy doing what I was doing. But I made the decision to finish school and to stop working so that I could finish school. I thought it was the right decision to make. And I also thought if I was as good as I thought I was, Ralph would hire me back. He was not pleased with me. He was very unhappy with me when I told him I was quitting. But I did it, and I didn't regret doing it, at least not in the beginning. And then a couple months after I made that decision, while I was in school, I got a phone call from Calvin Klein, who said, I want you to come work for me. I hear you're not working for Ralph. And I tried to explain to him the reason I'm not working for Ralph is I got to pay attention to school. And he said, have lunch with me. So I had lunch with him, and he was trying to convince me to come and work for him. And I said, I can't. I really can't. I got to pay attention to school. I got less than a year left. And he said, come across the street after we had lunch. Come across the street to my showroom. I want to show you my collection. He had just branched out from doing just coats and suits to doing a full women's sportswear line. And he was very proud of this collection he'd just shown. And he started showing me pieces from the collection. And he pulled up this A-line skirt. And he said, and this is my Harris tweed skirt. And I said, Calvin, that's not Harris tweed. And he goes, yes, it is. And I said, no, it's not. I said, that's not even 100% wool. What is that, wool and acrylic? And he goes, yeah. I said, where'd you buy that fabric? Anglo? And he said, yeah. I said, that's not Harris tweed. Harris tweed is hand woven in the Outer Hebrides Islands of Scotland. It's 28 wide, and it's 100% wool always. That is not Harris tweed. Well, I guess that was like catnip to him, because all of a sudden he raised the price of what he was going to pay. I knew more at 18, 19 than he did about
Calvin knew.
So he gave me the proverbial offer I couldn't refuse. He said, you come work for me whenever you have the time. I will pay you a weekly salary, whether you show up or you don't show up. He said, if you have schoolwork and you can't come in, just call me and let me know. So that's what I did for the last year of school. And my first year out of school, I worked for him, and I convinced him to go into menswear because that's what I wanted to do. Right. He'd been toying with the idea, but he'd never really done it. He entered into a contract with a company up in Rochester, New York, and he was very excited about it. He told me I was going to be vice president of design for Calvin Klein menswear. And I'm all of like 20 years old at this point, 20, 21 years old. And I mean, it was fantastic. And 2 weeks later, the deal fell through. And a couple couple days after the deal fell through, the people who put the deal together, who wanted to do this deal with Calvin, called me up at home at 8 o'clock in the morning and said, we'd like to back you. And we know that you were going to design this menswear line for him, for Calvin, and we'd like to back you because the deal fell through with Calvin. Wow. And I really didn't know what to do, Joey. I mean, I was confounded. First of all, how the hell did they find my phone number?
Yeah.
And so I went to work and I asked Calvin if he was free for dinner that night. I said, I got something I need to talk to you about. And he said, sure. And we went to Texarkana. Do you remember Texarkana?
I remember it well.
We're sitting in the back room of Texarkana. And I said to him, listen, I'm not hitting you up for a raise. I'm very happy with the money I'm making. I have a decision to make. The people who are going to back you in menswear want to back me. And I don't know what I should do. And Calvin looked at me dead in the eye. He said, Jeffrey, you'd be a fool not to do this. He said, this is a great opportunity for you. He said, they're great people. I'm sorry it didn't work out for me, but you should do this. And if it doesn't work out, you can always come back. And that was
really nice.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful. And yeah, I'm very proud of the fact that I still have a great relationship with both he and Ralph. Very friendly relationship with both of them.
It's amazing that you really have worked with the two premier designers in America between Ralph and Calvin, and you really cut your chops with them. And that went on, and this sounds so unreal that the people made an offer to you. So tell me, you took it, I assume.
I took the offer. I designed this collection. Our first buyer to come up to see the collection was Darryl Osborne, who was then vice president of men's and boys at Saks Fifth Avenue. And he came up to look at the collection. Irving Selbst, you remember Irving Selbst? I remember
the name.
He was the head of the operation. He made me show the line to Darryl. Darryl looked at the line, didn't say a word. I was terrified. I was really terrified. He got up to leave. He put his hand on the doorknob. He turned around and he said, Mr. Selbst, Saks Fifth Avenue likes this line very much. We want it. We want it for our stores. We want to do all the Easter windows with it. Wow. There's only one thing that you need to change. And Irving said, what's that, Darryl? He says, we want his name bigger. And that's how it started. I got all the windows on the 50th Street side of Saks Fifth Avenue, which they had never done to that point. That's all the windows for Easter were my clothes.
Now, how old were you then?
22.
22 years old.
22 years old.
God, that's unreal. To be so young and to be in that position of having your own line, man. I didn't really find myself until I was 29 when I decided to become an agent. But to realize at 22 and to be successful at 22 is fabulous. I can't believe it, Jeff. So now, this is in the 70s, correct? Right. And that's when the men's business is starting, as far as modeling and goes, it really started to take off. I remember in the 70s working with you, working with lots of other men's designers, where I could say that there were lots of men's designers, and not like today where there are one or two and you only know of one or two. Well,
what happened in the 70s was very much what happened in the 60s for women's wear. In the 60s, before the mid 60s in women's wear, there were manufacturers that had names like Maurice Rentner. That was a company that made expensive, beautiful women's wear. The designer was Bill Blass, but his name wasn't on the label. And all of a sudden in the 60s, people like Bill Blass, Donald Brooks, Jeffrey Bean, all of a sudden, even though they had been designing for years, the manufacturers started to use their label, use their name on the label, or they bought out the manufacturer so that the company was their own. The same kind of thing started to happen in the 70s early 70s with menswear in America. People like Bill Kaiserman, Alexander Julians, Sal Cesarani.
Yeah.
You know, these are Arthur Richards. These were all people who started to produce their own lines under their name and become known for that.
Right.
Part of how that happened was there was something called MFA.
I remember that well.
Yeah, the
Well,
MFA really looked to Men's Fashion Association, Chip Talbert, Tom Julian, Kevin Cryer, the people who were involved with that. They looked to promote the men's industry from a fashion standpoint.
let me elaborate a little on that MFA. The women had a fashion week,
Right.
where they would show their line.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened is that MFA got together, called the Men's Fashion Association, and put a week together where they could show all the different men's lines. Guys like yourself, guys like Ralph, guys like Stock, all the people you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
were able to show. Plus, a lot of newcomers would come in and they would feature their clothes.
Right.
Now, it was like a repertory company, you know, because they'd invite 10 models, they would pay 10 guys, probably the guys who were most popular, like Tony Spinelli, Jeff Aquilon. I think Tony went to every MFA there ever was.
You're right.
Because he was a favorite.
He was.
And what they did with the guys is they showed clothes from each designer on all the guys, you know. They would do the 9 o'clock show with Jeffrey Banks, the 12 o'clock show with Sal Cesarani, and so on and so forth. So they just wore everybody's clothes
Right.
with the same models. And, you know, they got associated with the clothes, and a lot of the designers got associated with the models. And it worked very well. And today we don't have that, Jim.
No. Well,
We don't have.
the thing that was so great about the MFA was, first of all, it was like summer camp. I mean, generally you were in Spring Lake, New Jersey, which was a beautiful setting and pastoral. You were in this wonderful all white, you know, sort of like the White House veranda kind of.
Essex House, the Essex House.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great place. Everybody had their meals there. The editors and the press stayed there. They had rooms there. The models stayed there.
Had rooms there.
Swimming pool. I mean, it really was like a little vacation away from New York to be.
It was.
They actually, one of the things I remember was they always had like a couple of movie nights, and we got a couple of premieres. We saw Rocky. We saw Rocky at MFA, the very first Rocky movie, before anybody else did. So it was a real collegial atmosphere, and everybody helped everybody else. That was the one thing that I loved about it. If Sal Cesarani was having a show and he needed help backstage changing them up, I was there doing the ties and helping him. The fact that he was a competitor didn't mean anything, and he'd do the same thing for me. I wish that kind of spirit still existed today.
Yeah. For me, too, as an agent, I used to go for the week. And I don't remember many other agents going, but I could afford, and my company was big enough that I can go away for the week and hang out. And I remember hanging out with all the guys, whether they were with Ford or whether they were with Wilhelmina or Stewart or Zoli. We all hung out together, you know, and I mean, some I represented, some I didn't. I never came on and said you should be with Ford or they're a bad agent and, you know, you were the terrible company. So it was a lot of camaraderie. And as you say, people helped each other.
Mm-hmm.
People were involved with each other. There was competition and competitiveness, but it wasn't like it is today.
No.
Today, it's a different story. It's very disjointed, or, you know, the models don't get together. I assume it's the same thing with the people who design clothes or designers. It's very individualistic,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Well, there was a period of time, I would say the 80s, early 90s, when Stan Herman took over as president of the CFDA, working along with Fern Malice. There was a collegial aspect to the Council of Fashion Designers of America, where designers supported each other, knew each other. It was a great kind of meeting place. It's harder to do that today. I think the members would like more of that. You know, but business is harder. It's much harder today to maintain your business, keep your business going. It was very collegial for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And one of the things that galvanized us as a design group, men's and women's designers, was the AIDS crisis, because that was something to rally around. And I mean, I remember when we did the first 7th on sale, it was amazing, Joey. I mean, we raised $4.5 million in 3 days. And designers pitched in, the stores pitched in. You had Bergdorf Goodman working with Saks Fifth Avenue working with B. Altman working with Bloomingdale's, Ralph Lauren supplying the cash registers and the people to man them, you know, to raise this money. It would be almost impossible to do something like that today. It's a shame, but
The CFDA brought everything together, I think, when they decided to do the shows in Bryant Park. As you say, a lot of the manufacturing and a lot of the designers were located down that way.
It was a golden era because it was centrally located, number one. Designers who were in the garment center could literally roll their racks a few blocks south or north or west or east, you know, to that setting. For the press and the buyers, it was one-stop shopping. I mean, they could see 3-4 shows, you know, one right after the other in that same setting. Fern arranged for people to have lunch there. There was a room where editors could phone in their stories, go back to their offices to do it. It was wonderful. It's you know, and you know, 20 years later, we still hear people say, I wish the shows were back in Bryant Park. But what happened was designers' egos got in the way, and they all decided they want to show in their own venues, in their own places, and you know, just,
you know, when you say their egos got in the way, I love to bring up that supermodels were made supermodels by the designers.
yeah.
They created a monster by making supermodels because basically they were all bidding for the same model. And the time the model got booked, the rate was astronomical.
It was crazy.
And then they wanted exclusivity on them and not to do other shows. And the rates were just going out of this world. And then all of a sudden, they came back down to earth and said, why am I giving her that money? Well, why not give? Because you made it that way. You guys made the models what they are by raising the rates, by competing and bidding on them. I said, and now this is what you get. They don't want to take a step for less than $1,000.
Right. I had the only time I ever went to an Andy Warhol event. He had a dinner at that the church downtown that was turned into a disco on 6th Avenue.
Right.
And the dinner was in the basement. I'm sitting next to Eileen Ford, your old partner in business.
Right.
She starts telling me that she thinks designers, people like myself, should pay extra once we've done a videotape of our fashion show and we want to run that video in a department store. She thinks that we should pay extra. And I said, Eileen, you're out of your mind. I said, I'm already paying the models X amount. I pay for 2 hours before they show up. I pay for 2 hours after they leave. I pay for the show, and now you want me to pay? And the two of us got into it. And Joey, I have to tell you, I've never struck a woman, but I was this close. And I realized I have to leave. I left before dessert because I was so angry with her that I knew if I stayed, it was going to be a disaster.
She was right, though. She was right. Now they charge for that film. that they do of the shows, you know. What we started at, Jerry started charging for everything after the show. There was just a big lawsuit on one of the magazines was doing shows, and they were then supplying the shows to, well, no, they were filming the shows, and then they were supplying them to their customers. And I know there was a lawsuit. I don't know how it was settled. But Eileen was, you know, she understood. And Jerry was able to execute it, not by her arguing with you all night, but he was able to do it. Another thing about men's fashion, I remember when a designer was starting out, he'd call the agency and say, Joe, you know, I need 4 guys, 5 guys, but I don't have the money. I can't, but I could give you some clothes. I can dress the model, like whatever he wears, he could keep, you know, and things like that. And as agents, and I know not just myself, we always worked with you guys, you know, on making you get your job done, making you able to advertise, no matter what it cost us, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll tell you a great story. When I started designing on my own under my own name, that very first year, 1977, I was nominated for Designer of the Year, Best Menswear Designer of the Year. My first year in business. Now, I didn't think I'd win. I had no conception that I would win. I was going up against established designers. But then I got the shock of my life because I was awarded a special Cody Award, the very first one ever issued for my men's fur collection.
Wow.
I had 31 styles of furs in that first collection. And my idea for the Cody Award show was to have one by one, 31 guys come out in these incredible fur coats. Now, I didn't have the money to pay 31
guys,
you know, but I had become friendly with them. I become friendly with people like yourself, with Zoli, and somehow or another we worked it out so that these guys show for me as a friend for free. And I got to tell you, the applause and the accolades when you saw 31 gorgeous guys standing from one side of the stage to the other in these, you know, tremendous fur coats. It was incredible. It was incredible.
Yes, we work together. We try to help each other out. You know, we were all in the beginning. The men's business was starting to boom. The men's fashion business was starting to boom. And I like to say we all grew up together, Jeffrey. And we've had friendships over the years. And I can say that we're all still friends, even though I'm out of the business. But all the designers and people like that, I still talk to, I still see. And it was a great camaraderie. And so tell me, after you started winning all these men's awards, you know, and what else have you know, I know you've, in your resume, you've got a list of accolades, you know.
I guess one of the great things that happened for me was in 1980, I was asked to design the Morona Sport collection. Now, I didn't conceive of it. The collection was conceived by another designer, but Don left the company, or was asked to leave the company, and they asked me to come in and design it. And when I did, this was the first athleisure collection. It wasn't called athleisure, but back in 1980, that's what it was. It was cotton clothing, sweatshirts, sweatpants, everything had an elastic waist, shorts, polo shirts, French terry, in real wonderful colors, and fairly inexpensive. And it was for men, women, and children. And the first year that I started designing Morona, their volume was about $7 million a year. Within 6 months, we were at $70 million a year. And within a few years, we were at $150 million a year. You know, so that was an incredibly commercial, fun a collection to design. And the fun part of it was seeing how many people wore it.
Yeah.
You know, whether it was the Hamptons, whether it was North Carolina, whether it was California, wherever I went, whatever airport I was in, I was watching people who were wearing Morona, men, women, and children. So that was great, and financially, it was a terrific boom for me. Two other kind of important milestones for me was I did women's wear briefly in the mid '80s, which I was very proud of doing. But I also did my first book in 2007. It was a book about tartan plaid. I didn't know anything about writing a book, but I had this burning desire to write about something I'd been obsessed with since I was a little kid. And I went to Barnes & Noble and I bought a book called How to Write a Book. I followed it to the letter. I got my book published. It took 5 years. It was 268 pages, and it weighed 6 pounds, 6 ounces. But we had our opening party, launch party at Saks Fifth Avenue, and we had 750 people show up, and they all bought books. So I said I would never do another book after that because it was such a hard thing to do, but I'm working on my 7th book right now. So clearly, it's like childbirth, you forget the pain. And the great thing about a book is it's like a lasting legacy. It will last, you know, far longer than, you know, my time on earth. But, you know, I've been able to, I wrote a biography of my friend Perry Ellis. I wrote a biography of Patricia Underwood, the great milliner. I wrote a book which is a history of preppy dressing, and I wrote a biography of the great Norman Norell, who was one of the greatest American designers ever. So that's been great. And then probably the other thing that I'm very proud of was that for 13 years I was on air selling the Jeffrey Banks home collection.
Oh, right, on H,
on HSN.
Home Shopping.
And newsflash, I'm going back on HSN. So I'm very excited about that.
Also, you did the first, didn't you do the Johnny Walker collection? Which was the first sort of product of that wasn't really in the men's business, but yet branched out in the clothing business.
Right. Marvin Traub, after he left the chairmanship of Bloomingdale's, started his own consulting company, and one of his first clients was the Johnny Walker brand. And they wanted, this is around 1990, 1991, they wanted to try to change the perception of single malt scotch as a drink that your grandfather drank. Right. They want to make it young, hip, and cool. And in those days, frat boys were drinking beer, and maybe if they were a little more sophisticated and working on Wall Street, they were drinking Cosmopolitans. Right. But they weren't drinking single malt scotch. And so his brief was, how do you change the perception of scotch drinking? And he did a focus group, and he figured out that young men, their market, what they loved were electronics, they loved music, and they loved clothing. And he decided, okay, the first brand extension of Johnny Walker is going to be a clothing line. And he brought me in to design it. And the other goal was to get a commercial on TV. And we achieved both of those things. We had this great clothing line called Johnny Walker, and we had the first hard liquor commercial on TV.
Wow.
Today, you see it all the time, but in those days, it didn't. And the tagline was Johnny Walker, the spirit of a man. So are we talking about what he drinks, or are we talking about his metaphysical being?
Exactly. Great. That was a great campaign. I remember it. Now, let me ask you, let's get back in those days, there were lots of men's magazines. Mm-hmm. The way there was female models wanted to be in Vogue in the editorial pages and Harper's. We had a bunch of magazines like GQ, Esquire, even Playboy did a men's
Yeah.
section. And I remember magazines like Cavalier that Bob Beauchamp worked for,
Mm-hmm.
and people like that. Was it hard to get into the magazines, or did they come to you because they saw your line or they saw your clothes?
No,
And
they came to me. They came to me. You know, what was different in those days, the people who were on the cover of the magazines were models, were male models.
Exactly.
And that they became stars because once GQ or Esquire featured those models more than once, the buying public wants to know, who is that guy? You know, who is that Renault White? Who is that Dennis Lamarche? Because they saw them on the cover more than once. Today, whether it's Vogue or whether it's GQ, it's all about celebrities. I mean, that's who you see. You rarely see a model on the cover of a fashion magazine. It's all
Any,
about
male or female.
yeah, yeah. That's the big change from the way it was. But you know, for male models in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, you know, it was a big deal. If you could get a cover of GQ, that would lead to your getting a fragrance contract, you know,
Exactly.
or
Exactly.
our
Oh,
contract.
guys like Rick Edwards, Tony Spinelli, Bob Mena, Renault White, Urs, you know, everybody was doing covers, but models were doing covers. And it was the same way with the women.
Yeah.
You know, if a female got on the cover of Vogue or Harper's Bazaar, it was so much easier for her to get a Revlon contract or something like that. But these days, it's only celebrities, only celebs that are on the covers.
Yeah.
You know, if you have a hit TV show for 1 year, you're on the cover.
Or you got a new movie coming out, you know.
Yeah, you're on the cover. And nobody uses the female or the male model. First of all, most of your male magazines have disappeared.
Yes.
Some are online. I mean, some have just fallen along the wayside. But let me ask you something. Is there an online editorial type of something that you could show your clothes? I don't believe there is. I don't know.
Not really. I mean, there are a couple of niche magazines like there's The Rake, which is, you know, finance, beautiful paper, beautiful printing, wonderful writing, wonderful reportage of fashion. But, you know, that's like a $20 magazine.
Yeah.
You know, that's not something you're going to see everywhere. And, you know, the other real problem, Joey, beyond everything, is the fact there's no newsstands anymore. I mean, New York you used to have shops that sold magazines, Italian magazines and
Yeah.
French magazines.
Yes.
You can't even find those places. I mean, in the city of New York, I can only think of 3 or 4 places where you could go today to get that. And newsstands on the corner sell New Yorker, New York Magazine, the New York Post, the New York Times, the Daily News. That's it. They don't even sell magazines anymore.
Yeah.
So,
I remember we used to go to Rizzoli
yeah,
and get all the Italian magazines,
all the Italian,
French
all the
magazines,
German, all the French,
you know, just to keep up our female portfolios. And when guys went over to work for Womo Vogue and stuff,
oh yeah,
we'd get all their pictures to be able to put in their book. You're right. That's nothing like that anymore. It's the business has changed a lot, Jeffrey.
yeah.
I know you're in the thick of it, but we don't have do we have men's shows? They talk about Men's Fashion Week. Is there a Men's Fashion Week? Or does
There are not enough shows to constitute a whole week. Basically, there are 2 days, maybe 3 days worth of shows. The people who show, the Todd Snyder, who didn't show for years, just started to show again. They're you know, some of the smaller brands. So that's really relegated today to 2 days, 3 days maximum of in New York. And that sometimes in the summer conflicts with what's going on at Pitti in Italy. So you have a much better chance of having a fashion show in Europe than you do here. I mean, people like Armani still show, but they show in Europe. They don't show in America.
They don't show it.
Even Ralph Lauren, when he debuts his men's collection, he does it in Italy. He doesn't do it in America anymore.
It's a shame how all that has moved away to Europe, and Europe is also not what it used to be. I mean,
It's not.
It's changed a lot. I remember in Milano, the Fiera, everybody was in the same place, like O'Brien Park, and that doesn't happen anymore, Jeffrey. I would assume doing business today is much more difficult than it was then. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. Much harder. And the crazy thing is, we always, growing up, you always thought, okay, 10 years in, it'll be easier to do this than it was when we first started out. And it's actually much tougher today tougher to do business with the stores. The stores want more from you as a vendor. How you get your information out there. I mean, it used to be like, for example, there's no DNR anymore. Menswear is covered by Women's Wear Daily.
Right.
On a daily basis. It's done on a, couple times a week, maybe a couple times a month. They'll cover menswear. It used to be, if I did a show, if I spent $500,000 putting together a fashion show to show in New York, I knew I'd get the cover of DNR, sure, 2 pages.
But now it's
if I get one picture in Women's Wear today for doing a show, it's a lot.
Jeffrey, thank you. We all, we know the business isn't what it used to be. And guys like yourself who've made the business, I herald you, but it's a business now that really doesn't shine on the men's designers. They're there, they work, they present, but it doesn't have the glamour and the excitement that it used to have. Jeffrey, we've run out of time. I enjoyed this interview very much because I learned a lot more that I didn't know. But thank you, and thank you for coming. And I hope to have you again, maybe with a bunch of the other guys from MFA. We'll all get together and shoot the breeze. All right.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Thank you so much.